An agent, the sudden collapse of a lifelong devotee, the perfectly timed tragedy. It's almost a masterpiece. There's one problem with the chemistry. I reached down and touched a small, shimmering bead of residue that hadn't yet turned to ash. I held it up to the light. "This isn't a necrotic rot," I said, my lawyer brain clicking into high gear. "This is a slow-acting corrosive catalyst. It doesn't work instantly. It takes exactly 72 hours to eat through a jade seal of this grade, which means the poison wasn't planted by Elder Hanjo 10 minutes ago." I turned to face Sulan, my expression one of mild, professional boredom. "The catalyst was applied 3 days ago, the exact moment we returned from the ancestral realm. The only person with the key to the vault during those 3 days, and the only person who would have known the exact composition of the heart seal to brew the correct solvent, was the woman who spent the last hour pretending to be heartbroken." Sulan's face didn't crack, it froze. "This is absurd. A live-in husband playing at being an investigator? Who will believe you?" "I'm not asking them to believe me," I said. "I'm asking them to look at the elder's wrist." I pointed to Hanjo's left arm. Under the sleeve of his robe, a faint, purple bruise was pulsing. An agent didn't use words to convince him. He used a puppet sleeve charm. A low-grade mental bind that forces the victim to perform a specific action at a specific time. But there's a side effect. The charm leaves a residual burn on the meridian. If we bring in a proper healer, we can trace the signature of the charm back to the person who cast it. I let the silence stretch. I could see the panic starting to bloom behind Sulan's eyes. She had played the board perfectly, but she'd forgotten that I don't play the board. I read the contract. And her contract had a massive, gaping hole in the timing. "The charm is a common tool among the Goldfall sect's lower disciples," I added, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I wonder if the Imperial Court would be interested to know that a Sioux elder was collaborating with the very people who just tried to occupy this city." That was the kill shot. In the world of cultivation, a mistake is a shame, but treason is a death sentence. Other elders didn't wait for her to answer. The shift in the room was violent. The respect they'd held for Sulan evaporated, replaced by a cold, territorial rage. They didn't just remove her, they erased her. Within an hour, she was stripped of her robes and thrown into the clan's deepest cellar, her influence shattered like the jade seal. As the dust settled, Wanqing walked up to me. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. She reached out and took my hand, her grip firm and possessive. Milestone. Final internal threat neutralized. Guard, 29% to 35%. Plus 2 boons plus 30 devotion. The surge of power was a physical weight, a thickening of my presence that felt almost suffocating. I felt my jaw sharpen, my gaze steady, the final remnants of the doormat image sloughing off like dead skin. I wasn't just hiding a secret anymore. I was becoming a man who didn't need to hide. "You're a very dangerous man, Zhongmu," she whispered, tracing the new hardness of my expression. "I just know where the fine print is." Left for the capital the next morning. The journey was a blur of luxury and tension. We traveled in a Sioux clan carriage, a floating pavilion of silk and sandalwood. I finally abandoned the floor and the cautious edge of the seat. I sat beside her. We spent the trip not in silence, but in a strange, charged conversation about the convocation, the politics of the Imperial Court, and the terrifying reality of what happened to the failures who were summoned to the capital. By the time the spires of the Imperial City rose over the horizon, the bond thread was humming a constant golden tune. I could feel her trust in me, a genuine, budding reliance that paid out in steady streams of devotion. I was no longer the joke. I was her strategist, her secret weapon, and, though she'd never admit it out loud, the single mirror reflecting her true self. The Imperial City was a forest of white marble and gold leaf, crowded with the most arrogant, powerful, and lethal young men and women in the kingdom. Dozens of them. Each one a prodigy, each one a monster in the making. As we stepped out of the carriage, the weight of 1,000 judging gazes hit me. They didn't see a cultivator. They saw a man in drab robes standing next to the frostflower of Cloudfall. Laughter started almost immediately, the soft, mocking titter of the elite who had heard the rumors of the Sioux clan's joke husband. I didn't mind. I actually liked the sound of it. It meant they were blind. But as I scanned the crowd, my smile vanished. Leaning against a jade pillar, far removed from the noise and the glitter, was a figure draped in the hue of a dried riverbed. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't judging. He was just watching me, his coin-like eyes reflecting the golden thread between me and Wanqing with a terrifying clinical interest. He didn't speak, but as our eyes locked, he raised a single finger and traced a slow, deliberate line in the air, the exact shape of a leash. The convocation hadn't even begun, and I realized I wasn't just entering a tournament. I was walking into a trap that had been set long before I ever woke up in this world. The final was held at noon in the main arena, in front of more people than I'd seen gathered in one place in either life, a bowl of white stone and banners. Every sect in Yunzhou represented somewhere in the stands, and at the center of it, waiting, the man who'd once called me a fence post. Yan Zhuo looked good. That was the first thing I noticed, and it told me almost everything I needed to know. A man who'd bought his way into a fight he couldn't earn should look desperate. He looked rested, confident. A gambler who's already seen the cards. "You're wondering why I paid for this," he said before the herald had even finished the introductions, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "I'll save you the suspense. I don't intend to beat you with strength this time, doormat. Goldfall spent the last several months developing something new. A formation array specifically calibrated to counter irregular cultivation signatures, the kind that doesn't match its own registered realm." His smile widened, and for the first time since I'd known him, there was nothing lazy in it. "You've been hiding something from every jade slab in this kingdom for months. Today, in front of everyone, I'm going to show them what." I felt the cold click of understanding land exactly where I didn't want it to. He hadn't bought his way in to beat me. He bought his way in to expose me, a live demonstration, witnessed by every sect that mattered. Full of a body temper who fought like something else entirely. Win or lose the match, the moment that array activated, the disguise I'd been running since the well would be over in front of the one audience that could never be talked back down. "That's an expensive way to lose a fight," I said, keeping my voice level, buying the half second I needed to actually think. "It's not expensive if I'm not trying to win the fight," Yan Zhuo said. "I'm trying to win the story. And the story where the Su clan's doormat turns out to be a fraud who's been lying to the Jade for years is worth considerably more to Goldfall than a duel ever was." The bell rang before I could answer, and the array he'd mentioned lit up along the ring's perimeter a half second later, a half lattice of pale characters etched into the arena floor, the kind of formation you don't improvise. The kind you commission from a specialist and pay a fortune to calibrate exactly once. I felt it reach for me the instant it activated, not painful, diagnostic. A cold, precise pressure trying to read the actual shape of my cultivation instead of the shape I'd been showing the world for months. When I understood with lawyer's clarity that I had perhaps 4 seconds before it finished its measurement and broadcast the answer to every sect elder in the stands. 4 seconds is a long time if you've spent your whole life reading the one clause a contract doesn't want you to notice. The array read cultivation signatures, realm, stage, technique, fingerprint. It couldn't read feeling. It had no instrument for the thread, because the thread wasn't cultivation at all. It was something older than the realm ladder. Something the array's designers had never once thought to calibrate for because nobody outside a handful of dying legends knew it existed. I reached down the golden filament to Wanqing, 3 rows up in the stands, the same reach I'd used against the disruption formation the day before. And felt her reach back before I'd even finished forming the thought, faster now, more sure, the reflex fully hers rather than a thing she was still deciding to allow. And I fed the array exactly what it was looking for, not my true signature. Hers, borrowed through the loop the bond had built between us since the assassination raid. A sliver of her monstrous gold core strength that had been quietly anchoring itself in my spine for months, present in me, but never mine to claim outright. Present now in exactly the amount needed to blur the reading into static. The array's lattice flickered, strained, and reported back a signature that belonged to neither of us cleanly, a smear. A contradiction, the kind of result a specialist would spend months trying to explain and never manage to. Yan Zhou's smile didn't falter yet. He hadn't seen the readout. I had, in the corner of my vision where only I could. When I let my face show nothing at all while the most expensive weapon Goldfall owned failed to answer the one question it existed to ask. "Something wrong with your array?" I said. "It's calibrating," he said, and for the first time, something moved behind his eyes that wasn't certainty. We fought while it tried. He came at me with real technique this time, No longer the arrogant golden brute of our first duel, genuinely stronger now, genuinely trained. You, a man who'd spent months since his last humiliation actually working instead of only resenting. I gave him that much credit even as I read the flaw in his third exchange, the same kind of flaw I'd been reading in bigger, older men since the day I woke up in this body. Not a gap in his power, a gap in his certainty, the half-second hitch of a man who still, underneath the golden robes and the purchased array, expected this to be easy. I ended it with verdict, the same technique I'd built in the weeks after the duel: read the form, find the one line that unmakes it, strike there and nowhere else. He went down clean, no cruelty in it, no flourish, the same professional boredom I'd worn since the brute in round 1. The array behind us gave up its calibration attempt and went dark, having successfully reported nothing at all. We didn't erupt the way it had for round 1. It went quiet instead, the specific quiet of several hundred sect elders realizing, all at once, that the story they'd come to watch get exposed had instead just gotten more dangerous, and none of them had the instrument to say exactly why. "You beat him," Wanqing said, arriving at my side through the parting crowd, her gray eyes bright with something that wasn't just victory. Or self. In front of everyone. "He's done." "He's done," I agreed. "The other thing isn't." 'Cause as the crowd began to file out, murmuring about an array that had somehow malfunctioned in front of the one match it was built for, I felt the bond thread give a low, warning pulse, not toward Wanqing this time, but toward the arena's edge, where a thin, bust-robed figure had detached itself from the departing crowd and fallen into step beside me like he'd been walking there the whole match. He didn't look surprised by what the array had failed to find. He looked like a man watching a debt finally come due on schedule. "Clever," he said in a voice like parchment folding. "Borrowing her signature to blind their machine. I haven't seen that particular trick in longer than this kingdom has had a name." He didn't quicken his pace, didn't slow it. Just matched me stride for stride like gravity had personally assigned him the job. "I made the bond, you know. Long time ago, and for reasons that felt generous at the time." His coin-flat eyes came up to mine, and there was nothing cruel in them, just the patient, arithmetic certainty of a lender who has never once needed to raise his voice to collect. "Everyone who lends one day collects. I think it's time we discuss the terms you actually signed." "I made the bond." He said it the way a man reads a line he's read 1,000 times, all the weight worn smooth by repetition. "A long time before your kingdom had this name, or the one before it, or the one before that. Right work, mostly forgotten now, a way to let two people carry each other's weight when one of them would otherwise have none to carry. I gave it to your wife's line, and to others, and I have never once needed to explain myself to the ones who used it well." His coin-flat eyes didn't blink. "You used it well, Zhangmu, better than most. That's precisely why we're having this conversation instead of a much shorter one." Wanqing had gone very still beside me, her hand finding mine without looking, the thread between us humming taut. "What do you want?" she said. Not a question. A term she was setting on the table before he could set his own. "Only what was always owed," he said. "All you carry isn't a gift, clan head. It's a loan, structured the way all my loans are structured. The interest compounds in devotion, and at full weight, it comes due." He looked between us. Unhurried. "You're nearing full weight faster than most. Faster than I expected, if I'm honest, which I generally am not required to be. I'd have thought I had another year before this conversation became necessary." "Full weight," I said. "Meaning what exactly?" "In writing, if you have it." "I read contracts for a living, and I've noticed you're very good at describing your terms without ever quite stating them." Something that might have been respect crossed his ancient face. "You'll have the terms when you're ready to hear them without breaking something in the asking. Today isn't that day. You've just won a very public fight, and the man who bought his own humiliation is still bleeding on my behalf somewhere behind us. When I find it distasteful to conduct business while an audience is still dispersing." He inclined his head, the smallest fraction, to Wanqing. "Clan head, husband, I'll return when the thread finishes what it's already started. It won't be long." He turned and walked into the crowd, and this time he didn't fade or vanish. He simply became one more gray-robed figure among several hundred, undistinguishable, gone the ordinary way instead of the uncanny one, which somehow unsettled me more than the vanishing act ever had. We spent that night in the guest quarters the Sioux clan had been given for the convocation. poring over what fragments of old right lore Wanqing's family archives actually held, which turned out to be almost nothing, deliberately. Someone, generations back, had scrubbed the deeper records clean, leaving only the barest acknowledgement that a hearth bond was real, old, and never once fully explained even to the families who'd used it. Whoever redacted this knew exactly what they were protecting people from, Wanqing said, closing the last scroll. Or protecting the bond's maker from being understood too well. Both, probably, I said. A lender doesn't publish his own terms if he can help it. We didn't get much further that night. Word came at dawn instead, carried by a messenger in Ren Xiao's own household colors, and it wasn't about the lender at all. Ren Xiao's uncle petitioned the patron's faction overnight, the messenger said, breathless from running. Who accused him of consorting with the Su clan against his own sect's interests. He's being questioned. Formally, by men who don't usually bother with formalities. I felt the case reassemble around a shape I didn't like. Someone's using the fact that Ren Xiao befriended us as a lever against him. Which means someone in that faction was watching closely enough to know it was worth using. Lord Wei Han, Wanqing said flat, maybe, or someone reporting to him. Either way, a friend of ours just became collateral for information neither of us has given anyone. I was already moving. Already building the shape of the argument I'd need, not a legal one this time. There was no court that reached across sects, just the older kind. The kind built on leverage and reputation, and exactly how much a young lord's patron actually wanted the story of a betrayed protege following him home. We found Ren Xiao in a holding room at the edge of his own faction's compound, guarded politely, imprisoned all the same. He looked more embarrassed than afraid. I told them friendship isn't treason, he said when we were let in. They didn't find that as compelling as I'd hoped. We'll make it more compelling, I said, and turned to the officer at the door with the specific, unhurried authority I'd built a reputation on since a courtroom 3 months and a lifetime ago. Your patron's faction has a problem it doesn't know it has yet. When word gets out, and it will, I'll personally see to it. But a promising young cultivator was detained without formal charge for the crime of shaking a stranger's hand. Every prodigy in this convocation who values their own name is going to remember it the next time your patron comes courting alliances. I'm not threatening you. I'm doing you the professional courtesy of describing exactly how bad this looks in a week. So someone above your rank can decide whether it's worth it before I have to make it worse on purpose. The officer didn't answer. He didn't need to. Word travels fast among people whose whole currency is reputation, and Ren Xiao was released before noon. His uncle's petition quietly withdrawn, no formal record of any of it existing by evening. You didn't have to do that, Ren Xiao said, rubbing his wrists more out of habit than actual injury. I did, actually, I said. You're the first person in this whole convocation who looked at me and saw a person instead of a puzzle to solve or a threat to neutralize. That's worth defending. He grinned, the easy grin from our first match, mostly recovered. Careful. Can't keep talking like that, and I'll start thinking we're friends. We are friends. I just don't say it as often as I should. The system didn't ring for that. It doesn't have a meter for friendship, only for the one heart it was built to read. But the thread hummed warm anyway, and I understood, standing in that holding room with a friend I just pulled clear of a fight that wasn't his, but some things were worth doing whether or not anything was watching to pay out for them. We should have had the rest of the day to breathe. We didn't get it. The attack came at dusk, 3 streets from the guest quarters, fast and professional and clearly aimed at Wanqing specifically. A squad in unmarked gray who knew her patrol route better than they should have, who struck the instant her guard thinned to cross a narrow bridge. One who very nearly succeeded, because whoever had planned it had studied her habits for weeks and picked the one moment she was least protected. I felt the thread scream before I heard the fighting. I got there in time to see her take a blade meant for her throat across the forearm instead, a defensive read a half-second too slow. The first real wound she'd taken since the assassination raid, and I watched, helpless and body temper slow, as the bond did the only thing it could do with no other option available. It pulled, hard, drawing on the reserve we'd built together since the tournament began, and threw enough of my borrowed strength down the thread to turn what should have been a killing stroke into a survivable one. She finished the fight in under 10 seconds once the thread evened her back out. I finished the walk to her side feeling like something in my own chest had been wrung dry. What cost the system never bothered to itemize because it wasn't paying it, I was. You're pale, she said, breathing hard, her forearm already bound, more worried about me than the wound that was actually hers. Oh, I'm fine, I said, which was almost true. That cost something. I don't know what yet. Neither of us said what we were both thinking, that the thread had just spent itself keeping her alive, visibly, at a price I could feel and couldn't name. When somewhere in this city a dust-robed man who'd promised to return when the bond finished what it started, was very likely satisfied that it just had. Whatever the thread had spent keeping Wanching alive, it didn't come back overnight. I woke before dawn feeling like a man who'd given blood he couldn't spare, a hollowness under the sternum that no amount of sleep touched. When I checked the thread in the gray pre-dawn light, it looked the same as always, bright, steady gold, which somehow made the cost harder to name. Nothing about it looked spent. It simply was spent, the way a ledger can show a healthy balance right up until the day someone actually tries to withdraw from it and finds the number was never real. Wanching found me sitting up, staring at nothing, and didn't ask if I was all right. She'd stopped asking that question days ago, once she'd learned my silences were more honest than my answers. Only what it actually cost, she said instead. Not what you're willing to admit cost something, what it actually took. So I told her, as precisely as I could describe a thing with no unit of measurement, the hollowness, the sense of having handed over more than I had, a debt I could feel but not itemize. She listened the way she listens to everything that matters, without interrupting, filing it somewhere behind those pale gray eyes that had learned, over these last months, to hold more than ice. The system never explains what it takes, she said finally, only what it gives. I noticed that the first week you told me it existed, and I've been waiting for you to notice it too. I noticed. I just didn't want it to be true. Most true things start that way. She reached over and took my hand, plain, no performance in it. A gesture of a woman who'd stopped needing an audience to justify what she felt months ago. We're going to find out what full weight actually means, Jongmu, together, not because the system is going to tell us kindly, because we're going to make him. We didn't have to go looking. He came to us instead, that evening, in the quiet garden behind the guest quarters, without fanfare, with chairs already waiting under the plum tree like he'd known exactly where we'd walk before we did. Sit, the lender said, not unkindly. I promised terms, and I find I owe you the courtesy of explaining them properly, since you'll both be living inside them regardless of whether you understand the shape. We sat. He didn't. The hearth bond is old, he said, older than any realm ladder your kingdom worships, and it was never a cheat. Whatever your gold panel implied when it first spoke to you. It's a loan. I extend the instrument, two people carry each other's weight, and it is, for a while, genuinely beautiful. I've watched it be beautiful for longer than your civilization has had a written word for the feeling. But every loan I've ever made has a term, and the term is always the same. His coin-flat eyes moved between us, patient, without malice, which somehow made it worse than cruelty would have. At full weight, the bond calls in what it's owed, one life, paid to close the ledger. It has never once, in all the ages I've extended this instrument, been optional. One life, Wanching said very quiet. Paid by whom? By whichever of you the bond determines is the lesser cost to the other's continuation. He said it like an actuarial fact, not a threat, and that was somehow the most frightening part. It calculates. It is, in its own way, generous. It takes the one who would have less left to lose. I don't set that part. I only collect on it. I felt the old lawyer instinct come up through the cold, a part of me that reads a clause looking for the crack that lets a client survive a contract everyone else assumes is airtight. Then, I said, give me a date. Contracts have dates. Yours does too, or you wouldn't have known to come find us before it was due. Something that might have been the ghost of approval crossed his ancient face. The new moon, 3 weeks from tonight. I'll set 2 chairs again, and this time one of you will need to fill only one of them. He inclined his head, unhurried, and the same courtesy he'd shown from the very first sighting in the market. I'd advise you to spend the 3 weeks living, not scheming. I've watched clever people try to outlawyer this exact clause for longer than your kingdom has existed. None of them found the crack. I'd be very surprised if you did, husband, though I confess I've been surprised by you twice already, which is twice more than I've been surprised in longer than I care to count. He left the way he always left, No vanishing this time, just an old man in dust-brown robes walking unhurried into the dark, leaving 2 full chairs and a garden gone very quiet behind him. Neither of us spoke for a long time. 3 weeks, Wanqing said finally. 3 weeks, I agreed. Which is either a death sentence or the most generous deadline anyone's ever handed a lawyer. I've closed harder cases in less time with worse odds. This isn't a case, Zhang Mu. Everything's a case, I said, and meant it as comfort, not deflection. A case is just a problem with a deadline and an outcome someone's trying to force. I've never once found a contract with no exit, Wanqing. Not one. I intend to keep that streak. She looked at me a long moment, and something in her face, the fear she wasn't showing anyone else, the fear she'd apparently decided was safe to let me see, all softened into something steadier. Then we'll spend the 3 weeks finding your crack, she said. Both of us. Not you alone, protecting me from the search the way you tried to protect me from the duel. Deal, I said, and it felt, for the first time since a blind man had tried to sever this exact thread months ago, like the right kind of terrifying, a kind 2 people faced together instead of 1 person facing alone. We left the convocation 3 days later, the tournament's closing ceremonies a blur I mostly don't remember, the title of strongest pair in Yunzhou, settling onto us with a weight that should have felt like triumph and mostly felt like a countdown. Every sect in the kingdom now knew our names. Every rival who'd once called me a joke now measured his words around me. And none of it mattered half as much as the 18 days left on a lender's patient, ancient, unbreakable-looking contract. The carriage ride home was quiet, both of us turning the same problem over from different angles. When somewhere past the halfway point, Wanqing finally said the thing neither of us had said out loud yet. If it comes to it, she said, watching the road instead of me, I need you to promise me something. I'm not promising to let it be you. I wasn't going to ask that. Her gray eyes came to mine, steady, terrified, and absolutely certain all at once. I was going to ask you not to let it be either of us. Find the crack, Zhang Mu. Both chairs stay empty. That's the only version of this I'll accept. Then that's the version we're building, I said, and meant every word of it, though I still had no idea, that night, what shape the crack would actually take. Only that 18 days wasn't much time to find one, and that I had never once, in either life, let a deadline decide the outcome for me. The first thing I did when we got back to Cloudfall was clear the desk, scrolls, incense, clan history, all of it off the table. I wanted a flat surface, blank parchment, and silence, the same 3 things I'd wanted before every settlement in my old life that actually mattered. I spent the first 4 days of the countdown on one clause. Whichever of you the bond determines is the lesser cost. Dressed up as mercy. Read as a lawyer, it was a valuation, a cold audit of 2 lives, deciding which one the ledger could afford to lose. I turned it over the way I used to turn over a hostile contract at 3 in the morning, looking for the word doing more work than it should. A definition nobody bothered to write down because everyone assumed it was obvious. Lesser cost was doing an enormous amount of work for 4 syllables. Lesser to whom? Measured by what? A contract that never defines its own terms isn't generous. It's hiding something in the gap. The bond doesn't grade on power. It grades on devotion. And by the time we'd reached the city gates, the thread between us had thickened into something closer to a shared circulatory system than a loan, which meant, I was fairly sure, that whatever the lender used to calculate lesser, he wasn't measuring 2 separate ledgers anymore. He was measuring one, badly, and calling the difference a person. That was the thread I kept pulling, not the fear, the math. Wanqing found me there on the second night and told me I was overthinking it. The man was ancient, she said. We'd seen 1,000 pairs before us and already knew how this ended. I told her that was exactly why he was beatable. 1,000 years of precedent makes a man bored. Bored men don't expect a divorce lawyer to treat a death sentence like a badly drafted lease. I didn't tell her the ledger followed me into sleep. The system gave me regard, gave me the bloom, and stayed silent on the one number that actually mattered. I stopped asking the system. I asked the bond directly. For a week I didn't cultivate. I sat in the center of the room and pushed, not for power, not for a reward. I pushed my own stubbornness straight down the thread. I wanted to make the bond understand there was no version of Wanqing's continuation that didn't include me, and none of mine that didn't include her. It was slow, unglamorous work, closer to drafting the same clause 40 times until it finally said what I actually meant than to anything the bloom had ever felt like. No warmth flared, no panel chimed. Some nights I fell asleep at the desk and woke with my face against cold parchment, no closer to an answer than when I'd sat down, and got up the next morning and pushed again anyway, because a man who quits on day 4 of a 12-day problem was never actually trying to solve it. I was building a paradox on purpose. If the bond insisted on a lesser cost, I wanted both costs to read the same. Infinite. Not a number the ledger could round down to 0 on either side. On the 12th day it broke loose, not a chime, a physical snap, like a bowstring giving way. The thread flared white, and a line of text slid across my vision stripped of its usual gold, plain and clinical. Paradox detected. Mutual dependency critical. New pact unlocked. Both or neither. Terms. The bond refuses single severance. The ledger cannot be closed by a partial payment. Wanching felt it land the same instant I did, her hand white-knuckled on her sword hilt, her eyes wide. Her loan had stopped being a single life payout. It was a suicide pact now. Whatever the lender wanted, he couldn't take the cheaper one of us anymore. Both, or neither. I'd found the crack. He didn't wait for the new moon to tell me what he thought of it. We stepped out of the study's shadows 3 days later, unhurried, looking less angry than disappointed, a professor marking a typo in an otherwise clean exam. Old, he allowed. Messy. Unprecedented in 3 cycles of this kingdom. He didn't argue the law. He conceded it outright, which worried me more than a fight would have, and told me plainly that I'd mistaken the instrument for the whole of it. Northbond was the loan, but the world was the collateral. He turned to the window, to the rooftops of Cloudfall spread below, and said that centuries of watching couples grow strong on his grace had taught him something simple. Strength this loud earns envy, and envy this old never stays quiet for long. If the bond wouldn't sever itself, he'd let the world collect for him instead. He didn't vanish this time. He just stepped back into the dark and let the silence do the rest. When I sat there a long while after he'd gone, turning his last sentence over the way I turn over every threat that's actually dangerous, not for what it promised, but for what it didn't need to. A man doesn't warn you plainly unless he's certain the warning changes nothing. He'd conceded the contract. We hadn't conceded the war. I should have slept that night. I didn't. Sat at the same desk, the same blank parchment, and tried to draft a defense against an enemy that hadn't been named yet, which is a genuinely useless way to spend an evening, and did it anyway because the alternative was sitting still and listening to the ledger tick. I understood exactly what he meant the very next morning, when a scout rode hard into the courtyard on a horse foaming at the mouth and didn't even wait for it to fully stop before he started shouting for Wanqing. Goldfall had signed a pact. Not just Goldfall, every rival sect we'd humbled since the convocation, every disgraced elder who wanted the Sioux name gone, all of it stitched together overnight into one column. The lender hadn't used magic. He'd used networking, gone to everyone I'd humiliated and everyone Wanqing had outlasted, and handed them the one thing they'd never had before: a coordinated plan and a shared grudge. By noon the reports were coming in from every outpost around the city, each one worse than the last, 10,000 strong. Moving with a precision that meant a single hand was guiding all of it, not the usual chaos of a coalition assembled out of spite. Not a raid. An invasion, planned the way I would have planned one, patiently, with every variable accounted for in advance. The exact opposite of the arrogant golden certainty Yan Zhou had once walked into our courtyard wearing. Wanqing stood on the main hall's balcony, sword drawn, frost already crawling the blade. And for the first time since I'd known her, I saw something under the composure that wasn't confidence at all. Not fear exactly. The specific stillness of a general recalculating whether the walls she'd trusted her whole life were actually tall enough. I stood beside her and did the only thing I know how to do when the numbers turn ugly. I started counting what we actually had, instead of what we'd lost. Combined bond power, neither army had a formation built to counter. A clan that had learned, this last year, to stop treating its own strongest asset like a joke. Allies scattered across 3 sects who owed us something more binding than loyalty. And 18 days that had just, very abruptly, become considerably fewer than they'd looked from a carriage window on the road home. Horizon wasn't empty anymore. A dark line of banners and spears stretched across it as far as either of us could see, and somewhere behind that line, I had no doubt at all, A dust-robed old man was watching, patient as ever, to see exactly how expensive we intended to make his collection. We didn't have time to wait for the army to arrive. If we were going to fight a war against a lender who viewed human lives as rounding errors, I needed to know exactly what the collection looked like from the other side. The lender had mentioned 1,000 pairs. That meant 1,000 survivors. I spent 2 days digging through the Sioux clan's oldest archives, looking for names that had vanished from the records, not deaths, but erasures. I found one. A man named Elder Han, who had lived in a village 3 days' ride from the city, a place so small the map barely bothered to name it. He'd been part of a bond a century ago. He was still alive, which meant he was the one the ledger had decided was the lesser cost to lose. Wanqing didn't want to go. She saw it as a waste of precious hours we could spend on the walls. I told her that fighting an enemy you don't understand is just a slow way of losing, and that as a lawyer, I never walked into a deposition without knowing the opposition's prior cases. She agreed, but she didn't stop gripping the hilt of her sword the entire ride. The village was a cluster of gray stone huts clinging to a hillside, smelling of damp earth and old smoke. The wind never let up, and it had clearly been winning that argument for a long time. We found Han in a shack at the very edge of the valley. He wasn't a cultivator anymore. He was a shell. He sat in a chair made of driftwood, his eyes two clouded marbles that didn't seem to see the room, let alone us. His skin was the color of wet parchment, and he moved with a slow, rattling breath that sounded like gravel in a tin can. He didn't greet us. He didn't even blink when Wanqing's presence, thick and cold as a winter storm, filled the small room. I knelt beside him. I didn't use the doormat act. There was no one here to perform for. I just looked at him and asked what happened when the new moon came. Han didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was a dry husk, a sound that had forgotten how to carry weight. He told us about the day the lender came. He described the feeling of the thread snapping, not with a bang, but with a quiet, clinical click. He'd watched his wife vanish, not killed by a blade or a spell, but simply subtracted from existence to balance a book. But that wasn't the part that had broken him. He told us that the death was just the opening. The real payment started after the funeral. He described a hunger that didn't live in the stomach, but in the bond itself. Every time he remembered her, every time the grief hit a peak, he could feel the bond vibrating. The lender wasn't collecting a soul. He was harvesting the echo. The more Han had loved her, the more the lender had to eat. For 100 years, the system had been sipping from his misery, turning his mourning into a fuel that kept the lender's instrument running. The lesser cost wasn't about who was more useful to the world. It was about who was capable of the most enduring pain. I looked at the thread between me and Wanqing. It was gold, bright, and terrifyingly strong. If we were the most devoted pair the lender had seen in cycles, then the payout for our collection wouldn't be a quick death. It'd be a century of harvesting. Wanqing stepped back, her face a mask of pale stone, but I saw the way her fingers trembled against her robes. The clinical reality of the loan was finally out in the open. We weren't just fighting for our lives, we were fighting to avoid becoming a battery for someone else's cheat. Han reached into the folds of a tattered blanket and pulled out a small blackened piece of iron. It looked like a broken gear from a clock, pitted and scorched, with a single faint groove running through the center. He didn't hand it to me. He just let it drop onto the table between us. He told us that the man who'd come for his wife hadn't been the only one involved. There had been others, failures, rebels, people who had tried to break the bond from the inside. This piece of iron was a remnant of a focused reversal, a tool designed to push the energy of the bond backward, not to sever it, but to overload the ledger. He said it was a hint, a piece of a puzzle that told him the thread could be turned into a weapon if the survivor refused to grieve. I picked up the relic. It was cold, heavier than it looked, and as soon as my skin touched the metal, the hearth bond flared. Not a reward. Not a boon. It was a warning. The system didn't give me a panel. It gave me a vibration in my marrow that told me this object was anathema to the lender's rules. If you don't grieve, I muttered, looking at the iron, the lender starves. Han gave a small rattling sound that might have been a laugh. He told us to leave before the wind changed. He'd had enough of the living for 1 century. We rode back in silence. Wanqing didn't look at me for an hour, and when she finally did, her eyes had gone dark instead of gray, somewhere between horror and a resolve I hadn't seen from her before. She didn't ask about the relic. She didn't ask about the math. She just reached out and gripped my shoulder hard enough to leave a mark, and didn't let go for a long time. I spent the ride back calculating. If the lender fed on the gap between love and loss, then the only way to win was to close the gap entirely. We couldn't be a survivor and a victim. We had to be a single unit, a closed loop that the lender couldn't find a way into. The both or neither pact was the first step, but the iron relic was the key to the second. We didn't need to break the contract. We needed to bankrupt the lender. We reached the outskirts of Cloudfall just as the sun was dipping below the peaks, casting long, bloody shadows across the valley. I was already planning how to integrate the relic's frequency into our combined bond strikes, wondering if we could trick the system into seeing the invasion as the payment instead of our lives. Then the messenger arrived. He didn't ride into the courtyard this time. He crashed through the outer gate on a horse that had collapsed from exhaustion, his armor shredded, and his face covered in a layer of gray ash. He didn't even wait to dismount before he collapsed at the feet of the guards, coughing up blood. I stepped forward, the iron relic heavy in my pocket, and looked at the man. He didn't have a message for the clan head. He had a warning for the city. The coalition hadn't waited for the new moon. They hadn't waited for the 3 weeks to expire. The dark line of banners we'd seen on the horizon hadn't been a slow march, it had been a feint. The main force had bypassed the valley entirely, using a high-altitude route that should have been impassable. The messenger looked up at me, his eyes wide with a hollow, rattling terror. "They're here," he wheezed, the words barely audible over the sudden ringing of the city's alarm bells. "The outer wall. They've already breached the outer wall." The alarm bells were still ringing when we hit the inner courtyard. Most of the clan was in a state of high-functioning panic. Horses were hauling crates of arrows, elders were shouting contradictory orders, and the air felt like it was being squeezed by a giant hand. I didn't stop to check the casualties at the gate. There wasn't time. I grabbed Wanqing's arm and dragged her toward the center of the training grounds. We had less than 12 hours until the sun hit the peaks, and our combined bond strikes were still theory, never drilled. In a courtroom, a half-second delay is a missed beat. On a wall under siege, it's a hole in your chest. "Focus," I told her. "Oh, stop thinking about the wall. Think about the thread." I pulled the blackened iron relic from my pocket and pressed it against the center of my chest. The moment the metal touched me, the system didn't chime, but the bond thread flared. I felt it like a cold wire being pulled taut between my ribs and hers. I didn't ask her to cultivate. I asked her to lean. I told her to push every single drop of her gold core pressure through the bond, not as a gift, but as a flood. It was like trying to drink from a waterfall. The pressure hit me with the weight of a collapsing building. My vision blurred, and for a second, I thought the both or neither pact was going to buckle under the sheer volume of her ki. I didn't fight it. I used the relic to catch the flow, twisting the energy backward, filtering her raw power through the iron's frequency, and then snapping it back out toward the training dummies. The result wasn't a blast, it was an erasure. The straw dummies didn't explode, they simply ceased to be, replaced by a thin line of gray ash and a silence that lasted 3 full seconds. Milestone. First successful synchronized bond strike. Regard, 93% to 94%. +1 boon +20 devotion. I barely noticed the panel. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like they were made of wet sand. The cost of channeling a gold core's power through a body temper vessel is that you feel every single calorie of energy scraping against your insides. I coughed, tasting copper, and looked up at Wanqing. She was breathing hard, her gray eyes wide, staring at the empty space where the dummies had been. She looked at her hands, then at me, and the look wasn't just respect. It was the look of a woman realizing that the man beside her had just become her most dangerous weapon. "Again," I said, and I didn't care that my voice sounded like I'd swallowed a handful of needles. Until the timing is a reflex. We drilled for 6 hours. 6 hours of pushing, snapping, and collapsing. By the time the sky turned a bruised purple, my robes were soaked in sweat, and my muscles were screaming. But the timing was there. We weren't fighting side by side anymore. We were one system. While we worked, the allies started arriving. Ren Xiao came in first, his expression grim but his eyes brightening when he saw me still standing. He didn't ask for a greeting. He just reported the state of the Western approach and the quality of the coalition's armor. Then came Mei Lin, sliding into the courtyard like a shadow, her brown and green leather jacket dusted with the gray ash of the outer wall. She looked at the charred remains of the training grounds and gave me a slow, knowing grin. She'd spent the last 4 hours scouting the breach, and she had the numbers. Then there were the elders. Not the ones who had spent the last year trying to treat me like a footstool, but the ones who had actually seen the ledger. 3 of them, men and women who had once been the clan's most rigid traditionalists, stood in a line, bowing their heads. They weren't bowing to the clan head. They were bowing to the strategy I'd laid out on the map in the war room. I'd spent the last 3 hours turning the Sioux clan's defense into a legal argument. I'd identified the coalition's blind spots, the exact points where their coordinated precision would turn into a bottleneck, when the precise moment they would overextend their line. I wasn't a general, but I knew how to find the flaw in a contract, and a siege is just a contract written in blood and stone. The north gate is a distraction, I told the assembled officers, pointing to the map with a piece of charcoal. They want us to commit the bulk of our reserves to the wall. We'll give them the appearance of a panic. We'll hold the wall with a skeleton crew and the combined bond anchors, and we'll keep the heavy hitters in the center. When they realize the wall isn't breaking, they'll push their elite vanguard into the kill zone. That's when we close the trap. The elders looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see a joke. I saw a calculation. Dawn arrived not as a sunrise, but as a roar. The coalition hit the walls at first light. It was a wall of steel and screaming men, a tide of golden white robes and jagged spears. The sound was a physical thing, a vibration that rattled the teeth in my head. I stood on the ramparts, the iron relic pressed into my palm, watching the first wave of attackers slam into the Sioux clan's defenses. The wall held, but only because we were cheating. Every time the coalition's vanguard managed to push a foothold onto the stone, Wanching and I would lock. I could feel the bond thread snap tight, the gold light blinding and hot. I'd pull her power, the relic would modulate the frequency, and we'd release a combined bond pulse directly into the crowd. It wasn't a sword strike, it was a shockwave of pure, concentrated regard that threw a dozen men off the wall at once. All coalition's officers were baffled. They'd come for a clan of fragmented elders and a genius sword saint, and they'd found a tactical spine that didn't bend. Every time they tried a new formation, I had a counter ready before they could even signal the change. I was reading the battle like a deposition, anticipating the lie before the witness could tell it. By midday, the field was a slaughter. The coalition's vanguard was exhausted, their precision shattered by the unpredictability of our strikes. Wanching was a blur of deep blue and silver, her longsword carving through the air, her movements perfectly synced with the pulses of energy I was feeding back into her. I remember looking down at the courtyard and seeing the soldiers cheering. I remember the feeling of the bloom humming under my skin, the magnetic pull of the victory. For a few hours, I actually believed we'd won. I believed the math had worked and the lender's collection was just a bad debt that we'd successfully avoided. Then the air changed. It didn't happen with a sound. It happened with a sudden, oppressive weight that felt like the atmosphere had been replaced by lead. The cheering on the walls stopped. The soldiers in the courtyard froze. Even the wind seemed to stop breathing. I looked toward the horizon. The coalition's main army had stopped moving. They weren't attacking anymore. Instead, they were parting. A wide, silent corridor was opening in the center of the ranks, a path of submission and fear. A single figure stepped into the gap. He wasn't wearing gold or white. He wore simple, charcoal gray robes that fluttered in a wind that only existed around him. He didn't carry a sword. He didn't have a banner. He just walked forward with a slow, clinical gait, his presence expanding with every step until it filled the entire valley. I felt the hearthbond in my chest recoil. The thread, which had been a bright, confident gold, suddenly shivered and went pale. The system didn't give me a panel. It didn't give me a warning. It just gave me a feeling of absolute, crushing insignificance. Wanching stepped beside me, her sword trembling. She didn't say a word, but I could feel her heart hammering against the bond. She was a gold core, a generational genius who had faced the strongest fighters in the kingdom without blinking, and right now, she was shaking. The man stopped 100 paces from the wall. He didn't look at the army. He didn't look at the clan. He looked straight up at me, his eyes two voids of cold, calculated indifference. The pressure he released in that one look didn't just bend the air, it cracked the stone of the ramparts beneath my feet. I felt my cultivation, everything I'd earned, every drop of devotion, press flat against the floor of my soul. This wasn't a gold core. This wasn't even a nascent realm fluke. A coalition nascent realm elder had entered the field, and he was a full tier above everything we were. The nascent realm elder didn't attack. We stood at the edge of the field all night, not moving, not speaking, his cultivation alone doing the work 10,000 soldiers hadn't managed. I spent those same hours at the map, running failure scenarios. A gap between realms isn't a wall you climb. It's a ceiling, and it doesn't care how hard you push against it. Day 2 began with a sound that didn't belong in a siege. It was the heavy, grinding scream of the Westgate's iron hinges. Not a breach from the outside, but an opening from within. I didn't need to look at the monitors or the scouts to know what it was. A legal loophole in the defense. Someone with a key and a grudge had decided the Sioux clan's survival was a bad investment. I hit the ramparts just as the first wave of the coalition's elite guard poured through the gap. The betrayal had been clean. One of the outer circle elders, a man who'd spent the last decade pretending to be a loyal pillar of the community, had simply stepped aside and turned the lock. He was probably already halfway to the coalition camp, trading our lives for a promise of a seat in a new order. The chaos was immediate. The west wall had been our flank, the one place I'd told the troops they could breathe. Now it was a slaughterhouse. Then the signal flare went up, a jagged streak of crimson from the lower courtyard. Mei Lin. She'd been coordinating the inner wall rotations, keeping the scout lines tight. She was currently pinned in the kill zone between the west gate and the inner keep, surrounded by 3 squads of Goldfall's heaviest shock troops. She was fast, but she wasn't a gold core, and 3 squads was too many. I could see her from the wall, her leather jacket already shredded, losing ground with every exchange. Wanqing didn't wait for me to give an order. She didn't even look at me, she just vanished. Gold core sword cultivator moving on real panic instead of discipline is not something you want standing between you and her target. She cleared the first 2 squads in a heartbeat, precise and fast enough that most of them never got a blade up. But the moment she reached Mei Lin, the air shifted. The trap didn't snap shut with a sound, it snapped shut with a feeling. A shimmering, iridescent dome of ki surged up from the ground, sealing Wanqing and Mei Lin inside a perfect, airtight sphere of compressed energy. It was a containment array, designed specifically to isolate a high-tier cultivator and cut them off from any outside support. And then the charcoal gray figure appeared. The nascent realm elder hadn't walked to the gate. He'd simply stepped through the space between the horizon and the courtyard. He appeared 10 feet from the dome, his expression one of mild, academic interest. He didn't look at Mei Lin. He looked at Wanqing, the genius who had dared to hold the line against his vanguard. He raised a hand. No chant, no posture, no, just a slow, downward press of his palm. Mountain strike, I whispered. It was the most basic application of nascent realm power. He wasn't using a technique. He was simply commanding the weight of the world to occupy the same space as the dome. The air above the sphere didn't just push down, it solidified. The iridescent shield began to crack, the sound like 1,000 mirrors breaking at once. Wanqing slammed her sword against the ceiling of the dome, trying to brace the weight. She was a gold core, but she was fighting the gravity of a higher realm. Her knees buckled. The silver sheen of her hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, and her face was a mask of raw, desperate effort. She wasn't fighting for herself. She was shielding Mei Lin, who was curled in a ball beneath her, the scout's breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. The dome shattered. The weight hit them with the force of a falling peak. I saw Wanqing's spine arch, saw the blood spray from her lips as the pressure attempted to flatten her into the stone. This was the moment the lender wanted. The lesser cost rule was screaming in the back of my head. The lender didn't want a victory, he wanted a tragedy. He wanted the precise moment where Wanqing realized she couldn't save the person she cared about. He wanted the echo of that grief to ripen. I didn't run toward her. I couldn't. The pressure around the courtyard was too thick to navigate on foot. Instead, I closed my eyes and reached into the one place where the nascent elder had no jurisdiction. I grabbed the thread. I didn't just pull. I didn't just send chi. I used the both or neither pact as a bridge and the iron relic as a transformer. I forced the system to recognize a paradox. If Wanqing died here, I died too. If she broke, the bond broke. And if the bond broke, the lender's ledger would be empty. I poured every single bit of my will, every ounce of the bloom's refined presence, down that gold filament. I didn't try to lift the mountain. I just became the anchor. Hold on, I told her. I didn't say it with my voice. I said it through the bond, a raw, clinical command that bypassed her ears and hit her directly in the soul. I have the weight. Lean into me. I felt it then, a sudden, violent surge of pressure that would have crushed a normal man into a red smear. But I wasn't a normal man. I was a vessel refined by the devotion of a gold-core sword saint, backed by a relic that hated the lender's rules. I felt Wanqing's shock. I felt the moment she realized I was there, not beside her, but under her, taking the brunt of the nascent realm strike through the thread. For a second, the two of us weren't a husband and wife. We were a single, reinforced pillar of gold and iron. The pressure peaked. The stone beneath Wanqing's feet cracked into a spiderweb of ruins. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the weight vanished. The nascent elder stepped back, his hand dropping to his side. For the first time, the expression of indifference was gone. He looked confused. He looked at the spot where Wanqing stood, unscathed and breathing, and then he looked up at the wall at me. He had just delivered a strike that should have erased a gold core and a mortal both. Instead, he'd hit a closed loop, two ledgers reading as one, when there was nothing in his considerable arsenal built to collect from an account that refused to separate. He tried to harvest a tragedy. He'd found a bankrupt account instead, and by the stillness in his face, that had never once happened to him before. Milestone. The bond withstands a nascent realm strike. Regard. 94% to 96%. +1 boon +30 devotion. The panel flickered, but I didn't look at it. My heart was doing something I didn't have a legal term for. The strain of the transfer left my vision swimming, gray at the edges, when every muscle from my shoulders to my hands felt like it had been worked twice as hard as my body actually was. I stayed upright by refusing to consider the alternative. There was still a wall to hold, and a woman down in that courtyard who'd just taken a mountain's weight for a friend she'd known less than 2 months. The elder didn't attack again. He didn't even signal his army to advance. He simply turned around and began to walk back toward the horizon, his gray robes fluttering in the wind. He was retreating, not because he was beaten. He could still level the city if he felt like it. He was retreating because the experiment had failed. He'd tried to trigger the collection, and the paradox had pushed him back. As he walked, I felt a sudden, freezing chill run down the bond thread. It wasn't the elder. The elder was just the tool. This was something else, a presence that didn't exist in the physical space of the courtyard, but was watching us through the system itself. It was a feeling of immense, patient hunger. The lender wasn't angry. He was pleased. He hadn't gotten the death he wanted, but he'd seen the bond strengthen. He'd seen the both or neither pact hold under the weight of a mountain. For a man who harvests grief, a stronger bond doesn't mean a safer marriage. It just means the eventual payout will be that much larger. I looked down at Wanqing. She was standing over Mei Lin, sword still drawn, eyes searching the ramparts until they found me. Whatever was in that look, it wasn't just gratitude anymore, and it wasn't going away. I leaned back against the stone, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and realized the truth of our situation. We hadn't escaped the debt. We'd just increased the interest. The nascent realm elder's retreat didn't end the siege, but it broke the coalition's spirit. In a war, momentum is everything. When the most powerful man on the field decides the experiment is over and walks away, the soldiers left behind start looking at their officers with very different eyes. I didn't give them time to regroup. I didn't give them a chance to rationalize the failure. I went straight for the ledger. I spent the next 4 hours in the war room, not with a map, but with a series of letters, my hand cramping around the brush by the second one, and not stopping for it. This was the part of the job nobody watching the siege from the wall ever saw, not the strike, the paperwork after it, the part where a war actually ends. I didn't send them to the generals. I sent them to the sect leaders of the minor factions, the ones who had been promised glory and land in exchange for their blood. I didn't use threats. Threats are for people with armies. I used a disclosure. I laid out the cold, clinical truth of the lender's game. I detailed the lesser cost rule, the harvesting of grief, and the fact that the nascent elder hadn't been fighting for a new world order. What had been trying to trigger a specific, emotional collapse for a third party's profit. I treated the coalition like a fraudulent investment firm. I showed the minor sects that they weren't the vanguard of a revolution. They were just the collateral damage in a private debt collection. Well, the reaction was a landslide. By the next morning, 3 of the smaller sects had formally withdrawn. By noon, the Goldfall leadership was in a panic. Their legitimacy was built on the idea of a righteous claim to Cloudfall, and I'd just proven they were being used as unpaid interns for a cosmic loan shark. The fracture was instantaneous. Alliances don't break with a bang. They break when the people at the bottom realize the people at the top are lying about the payout. Goldfall sued for peace. They didn't even negotiate. They just asked for a way out. We won, but the victory tasted like copper and old stone. The siege broke, the coalition vanished, and the gates were finally closed, but the cost was written in the courtyard. The funeral was a quiet affair. We lost 14 disciples and 6 outer clan servants. Not a massacre, but enough to make the victory feel like a clerical error. A number I kept running in my head the way I used to run a settlement's fine print, looking for a way to make it smaller and never finding one. I stood among the mourners, wearing the same gray robes I'd worn since the start, watching the smoke from the pyres drift over the city. Auntie Bo was there, further back, her hands folded, not looking at me. She'd lost a nephew in the West Wall breach. When there wasn't a clause in any contract I knew that could argue that number down to 0. Munching stood beside me. She didn't wear her usual mask of indifference. She looked tired. Her silver-black hair was loose, catching the wind, and her pale gray eyes were fixed on the flames. When she didn't look at the dead, she looked at me. "You saved them," she said. Her voice was low, stripped of the ice. Not just with the bond, with the truth. I didn't have a clever lawyer's answer for that. I just stood there, feeling the weight of the lives we'd traded for a tactical win. Milestone. Mutual recognition of sacrifice. Regard. 96% to 97%. +1 boon plus 15 devotion. The panel flared, but the warmth it provided was thin. I didn't care about the numbers. For the first time, the people of the Sioux clan weren't looking at me as a joke, or even as a lucky charm. They were looking at me as the man who'd read the enemy's whole strategy and found the clause that broke it. I spent the following week cleaning up the mess. I handled the reparations, negotiated the exit treaties with the defecting sects, and ensured that every family of the fallen was paid in spirit stones from the coalition's abandoned supply trains, down to the last outer clan servant, whose name most of the inner court wouldn't have bothered learning a month ago. I did it all with the same detached efficiency I'd used to dismantle Sulan's forged decrees. It turns out grief and fraud get handled by roughly the same muscles. You itemize, you verify, you close the file, and you don't let yourself feel any of it until the paperwork's done, because the paperwork is the only part where feeling something actually helps anyone. But as the city settled, the silence became a problem. The lender hadn't come back, but the bond thread hadn't stopped shivering. It was a constant, low-frequency vibration in my chest, like a wire under too much tension, present when I woke and present when I finally slept, never once easing off. The both or neither pact had worked. We'd cheated the collection by refusing to be separate. The lender was a man of infinite patience and a very specific appetite. When I'd spent enough of my old life reading men like that to know patience isn't mercy. It's just a longer contract. He didn't care if we won the war. In fact, the more we won, the more we bonded, and the more we bonded, the richer the eventual harvest would be. I'd built us a paradox he couldn't legally collect on. I hadn't built us a way to stop feeding it. I noticed it first in the way the system began to change. The soft gold panels were starting to bleed a dark, bruised purple at the edges. The notifications weren't just rewards anymore. They were observations. Investment matured. The asset is now fully integrated. I woke up on the 14th day of the quiet to a feeling of absolute stillness. Not the peace of a quiet morning, but the specific stillness of a room right before a predator decides to finally enter it. I walked out onto the balcony of the inner keep. The city of Cloudfall was humming with the sound of reconstruction below us, scaffolding going up over the west wall. With people cheering the strongest pair in Yunzhou every time either of our names came up in the market crowds. 2 weeks ago that same crowd had called me a fence post. I hadn't decided yet whether the new version was any less of a costume. Wanqing was beside me, her hand resting lightly on the hilt of her sword, her gaze scanning the horizon out of habit rather than any specific fear, or so I'd thought. Then, the air shifted. It wasn't a pressure this time. There was no mountain strike, no crushing weight. It was simply a void. A hole opened in the reality of the courtyard below, a circle of perfect, shimmering blackness that swallowed the light and the sound. A figure stepped out of the hole. He wasn't wearing gray robes anymore. He was dressed in a suit of midnight silk that seemed to absorb the very air around him. He didn't look at the guards. He didn't look at the walls. He looked up at the balcony, and I felt the bond thread in my chest scream. The lender hadn't come to collect a debt through a proxy. He hadn't used an army or a nascent realm puppet. He had realized that the only way to break a paradox was to remove the variables from the equation. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a smile on his face, a thin, hungry expression that told me he was no longer interested in the interest rates. He was coming for the principal, and after months of learning exactly how patient this particular lender could be, I understood, standing on that balcony, that patience running out was the single most dangerous thing either of us had faced yet. The lender didn't attack. He just stood there in the center of the courtyard, a hole in the world dressed in black silk. He didn't use a sword or a spell. He used a conversation. He told us the terms of the new agreement. He didn't call it a debt anymore. He called it a choice. He offered a clean slate. If one of us walked away from the bond, not through death, but through a formal, systemic severance, the other would be granted a permanent exemption from the ledger. One of us could be completely free, with no strings, no looming collection, and a massive surge of refined chi as a parting gift. The other would simply cease to be bound. No grief, no harvest, just a quiet deletion of the contract. It was the perfect exit strategy. As a lawyer, I knew exactly what this was. It wasn't a gift. It was a wedge. He was betting that after months of fighting a losing battle against a cosmic loan shark, the instinct to survive would outweigh the instinct to stay. He was offering us the one thing the both or neither pact had forbidden, a way out that didn't involve a coffin. I looked at Wanqing. She was still breathing hard, her sword held low, her eyes locked on the man in black. I could feel her through the thread. She wasn't shaking, but she was wound tight enough that one wrong word would snap something. She was calculating. She was a gold-core genius. She knew the math. If she took the deal, I'd be free of the lender's shadow. If I took it, she'd be free of the ticking clock in her own chest and go on being the strongest sword in Yunzhou with nobody keeping score anymore. The lender spoke again, his voice a flat, clinical drone. He told us we had until the sun hit the meridian to decide. If we didn't choose, he'd simply stop negotiating and start subtracting. I didn't answer him. I walked over to Wanqing and took her hand. Her palm was calloused from the sword and cold from the wind, but she didn't pull away. I didn't tell her it would be okay. I didn't give her a speech about love or destiny. I just told her that the deal was a scam. I explained that a lender who offers a free exit is usually just trying to get the asset to move into a position where it's easier to kill. I told her that the only thing I trusted in this entire world was the fact that we were both too stubborn to fold. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a small, genuine smile touch her lips. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the look of a gambler who just found a way to cheat the house. She told me that if I was planning to stay in this mess, she might as well keep the most annoying man in Yunzhou around for the entertainment value. Milestone. Conscious rejection of the easy exit. Guard. 97% to 98%. +1 boon +10 devotion. The system flickered, but the reward felt different this time. Not a surge of power. A hardening. The bloom in my chest stopped glowing and just settled, heavy, permanent, the kind of weight that doesn't move once it's set down. The lender's expression didn't change, but the air around him curdled. He didn't like the answer. He didn't want a partnership. He wanted a tragedy. When the tragedy didn't happen, he decided to stop being a banker and start being a butcher. He moved. There was no wind-up, no posture. He simply ceased to be where he was and appeared 3 inches from my face. His hand shot out, not as a punch, but as a precise, surgical strike aimed directly at the center of my chest, the exact point where the bond thread anchored into my heart. I didn't have time to think. I didn't have time to calculate. I just reacted. I slammed the blackened iron relic against my own chest, using the impact to snap the bond thread backward. I didn't try to block the hit. I tried to overload it. I channeled the entirety of the 98% regard, the accumulated devotion, and the raw gold core pressure from Wanqing, and I shoved it all into the lender's palm. The collision was loud enough that I felt it in my teeth before I heard it. The force threw me backward, my boots carving 2 deep furrows in the courtyard stone. I hit the ground hard, the air leaving my lungs in a single violent burst. My vision blurred, and for a second, I tasted copper. The relic in my hand was hot enough to blister my skin, vibrating with a frequency that made my teeth ache. The lender hadn't moved. He was still standing in the same spot, but his hand was smoking. A thin, jagged crack ran from his wrist up to his elbow, the skin splitting to reveal not blood, but a void of swirling, bruised purple light. He looked at his hand with a flicker of genuine surprise. He hadn't expected the asset to fight back using the lender's own currency. Wanqing didn't miss the opening. She launched herself forward, her long sword a blur of frost and silver. She didn't use a standard form. She used a synchronized strike, her blade humming with the same frequency as the bond thread. She sliced through the air, a crescent of cold energy that tore into the lender's shoulder, shearing through the midnight silk and carving a deep, glowing line across his chest. He stepped back, unhurried, the wound clearly costing him nothing. He looked at the gash in his chest, then back at me. The surprise was gone. In its place was something far worse. He looked hungry. "Interesting," he said. "You've turned the loan into a weapon. You've managed to make the debt a part of your own anatomy." He raised his hand, and the air in the courtyard began to warp. The shimmering black hole he'd arrived through didn't close. It expanded, spreading across the stone like an ink blot on a map. The ground began to dissolve, the solid rock turning into a liquid, swirling abyss that pulled at our feet. I struggled to stand, my muscles screaming, my chest feeling like it had been hit by a battering ram. I looked at Wanqing, and I saw her face shift. The composure was gone. The ice had finally cracked. She looked terrified, not for herself, but for the way the bond thread was reacting. The thread wasn't just shivering anymore. It was glowing, a blinding violent gold that was starting to pull us toward the center of the void. The lender didn't attack again. He just watched us, his eyes tracking the gold filament as it began to unravel. He told us that the time for negotiations was over. He told us that since we refused to choose who died, he would simply take the whole account. He stepped forward, and as he did, the midnight silk of his robes began to peel away. It wasn't clothing. It was a skin. The human shape came off him the way a costume comes off, easily, like it had never been more than that. The face that emerged wasn't a face at all. It was a geometric nightmare of shifting angles and iridescent eyes, a creature of pure, predatory appetite that had spent eons pretending to be a man just to make the prey feel comfortable. I stared into that void, and I realized the mistake I'd made in my arithmetic. I'd treated this like a legal battle with a man who followed rules. But the thing standing in our courtyard didn't have rules. It had a hunger. The creature opened its mouth, and the sound that came out wasn't a voice, but the simultaneous scream of every soul the Hearthbond had ever collected. The sound wasn't a voice. It rattled my molars and made the stone under my boots feel unsteady, though it hadn't moved. The thing that had been the lender didn't have a face anymore, just a shifting set of iridescent planes, no two angles matching. It didn't speak in sentences. It put whole ideas directly into my head, no ears required, no room to argue with the framing before it landed. It wasn't a god. It wasn't even a spirit of law, whatever the old records had implied about a right older than the kingdom's name. It was a parasite, and every polite thing it had ever said to me, every patient smile in a market or a courtyard, had been the manners of something that had learned a long time ago that prey relaxes faster around a thing that says please. The Hearthbond wasn't a rite of marriage or a sacred vow, it was a lure. The system had spent eons refining the perfect bait, the promise of power in exchange for affection. It didn't care about the romance or the growth. It wanted the emotional echo. To this thing, a husband and wife who spent decades in a cold, loveless marriage were a light snack. But two people who had fought through hell, who had built a bond of absolute, desperate trust, who loved each other with a ferocity that defied the world, that was a feast. The lender had been farming us. Every milestone, Every tick of the regard meter, every moment of shared peril hadn't just been my growth, it had been the seasoning. It had encouraged our bond, pushed us into corners, and played the role of the antagonist just to make the eventual harvest richer. We weren't the winners of a game. We were the crop. I looked at Wan Qing. She was standing her ground, her sword trembling not from fear, but from the sheer output of ki she was pumping into the thread to keep us from being sucked into that void. Her eyes were fixed on the creature, her jaw set in that same line of stubbornness that had made me fall for her in the first place. Milestone. Recognition of the shared lie. Guard. 98% to 99%. +1 boon +5 devotion. The panel flared, but I didn't feel the surge. I felt the trap. The creature's plane shifted. Whatever it had been considering, it had finished. The vacuum in the courtyard intensified, and the void stopped staying still. It started eating the edges of the keep in small, clean bites, no drama to it, no visible force. A stone pillar 10 feet away simply stopped existing, and the air where it had been closed over the gap like nothing had ever stood there. Then the projection hit me again. The terms had changed. The lender was done with the long game. Oh, it didn't want to wait for a natural expiration or a slow grief. It wanted the account settled now. It gave me a new choice, a final reframing of the contract. One life. If I stepped into the void voluntarily, the bond would be severed instantly. The debt would be paid in full. Wan Qing would be free, her cultivation would jump another tier from the leftover energy, and the void would close. Cloudfall would be saved. If I refused, the lender would simply expand the erasure. It wouldn't just take me, it would take the courtyard, then the keep, then the city. Every disciple, every servant, every family we'd spent the last month protecting would be subtracted from existence to balance the ledger. It was a classic high-pressure settlement, the kind I'd talked clients out of 100 times in my old life, back when the stakes were a house instead of a city. The lender had identified the only leverage it had left, not my strength, not Wan Qing's sword, my conscience. It knew I'd spent this whole borrowed life playing the strategist, the man who ran the numbers on every soul in the compound before he did anything else. It was betting the lawyer in me would look at one life against 10,000 and sign without reading the rest of the page. I looked at the void, then at the city humming below us, oblivious to the fact that their existence had just become a line item in a parasite's ledger. I felt Wan Qing's hand tighten on mine. She didn't tell me to stay. She didn't even ask me to fight. She just held on, hard enough to bruise. When I understood without a word passing between us that she'd already run the same numbers I had, and landed somewhere colder and simpler than the lender expected either of us to. She'd rather burn with the whole city than let go of my hand first. I looked back at the geometric nightmare. I didn't feel the weight of a hero's sacrifice. I felt the irritation of a man who had just been handed a contract with a blatant error in the premises. The lender was assuming I cared about the framing it had chosen. It thought the only real choice on the table was between my life and the city's, one clean line item against another. That was its mistake, and it was a genuine one, not a trick. It had spent centuries collecting from people who read the bold heading and stopped there. It had never once, in all that time, collected from a man who'd built his entire career on the fine print underneath. I didn't let go of her hand. I didn't move toward the void. No, I said. The word was small. In that vacuum, everyone heard it anyway. I wasn't saying no to the rescue. I wasn't saying no to the 10,000 people below us who had no idea their lives had just become a line item. I was saying no to the framing itself. The lender had built a contract with exactly 2 exits, and I'd spent a career finding the third one nobody bothered to write down. The creature's plane shifted violently, the iridescent colors snapping into a jagged, angry red. The void surged, the wave of erasure leaping forward, the edge of the abyss screaming as it reached for our boots. The lender didn't get a chance to subtract us. Using the relic to overload the ledger had bought us a window, and that window was the only thing we had to move. We didn't go back to the city to celebrate, we didn't even stop to unpack. Instead, we turned our backs on Cloudfall and started walking toward the only place the lender couldn't simply erase: the source. The system stopped offering advice and started giving directions instead. Not words, a pull. The gold thread in my chest had stopped shivering and settled into a steady pull north. Toward a range of peaks that didn't appear on any of the Sioux clan's official charts. Pilgrimage was a slog. It wasn't a scenic tour. We spent 4 days climbing through shale and freezing fog, eating dried rations that tasted like salted cardboard. Every few miles, the thread would tighten, pulling us toward the hidden seams of the world. Wanqing didn't say much. She didn't need to. She walked beside me, her sword robe stained with gray dust, her gaze fixed on the horizon. I could feel her through the bond. She wasn't just protecting me, she was anchoring me. The bloom had settled into a permanent, heavy presence in my frame, and though I was still a fraction of her strength, I didn't feel like a doormat anymore. I felt like a man who'd found the loophole in a bad contract and was walking straight into the office that wrote it to demand his money back. On the 5th day, the geography stopped making sense. We hit a valley where the air didn't move, and the silence was so thick it felt like pressure in my ears. In the center of the valley sat a series of arches made of the same iridescent, shifting stone as the lender's true skin. They weren't buildings, they were filters. And they were guarded. They weren't monsters or sect disciples, they were people, or what was left of people. 2 men and 2 women, dressed in the rags of a dozen different eras, their eyes milky and vacant. They didn't stand like warriors. They stood the way a puppet stands, upright for no reason of its own. Alert. Bond avatars detected. Status: enslaved. The system panel was clinical. The reality was worse. These weren't guards. They were the previous accounts. Blender didn't just harvest grief and then move on. It kept the husks. It used the remnants of the most powerful bonds it had ever broken to guard the door to the source. As we stepped into the valley, the avatars reacted. They didn't shout. They didn't warn us. Their motions were jerky, fragmented, wrong in a way I couldn't name until one man launched himself at me, fingers curved into claws. He wasn't using chi. He was using the bond. I felt it the moment he touched my shoulder. He didn't try to punch me. He tried to pull the thread. He was trying to rip the connection between me and Wanqing out of my chest and feed it into the void. It was a parasitic strike. A direct attempt to settle a debt that wasn't mine. I didn't fight him with a fist. I used the relic. I slammed the blackened iron into the point of contact, not to push the energy back, but to invert it. Well, if the avatar wanted to pull, I gave him everything. I opened the floodgates of the 99% regard, the accumulated devotion, and the raw, unfiltered gold-core pressure of my wife. The result was a short circuit. The avatar didn't just fly back, he shattered, not into pieces of bone but into shards of gold light. The system flared, a sudden, violent burst of data. Siphon interrupted. Residual bond energy recovered. +20 devotion. +1 boon stored. Wanqing moved faster. She didn't waste time on the others. She carved a path through the avatars with 3 precise, frost-bright arcs of her blade, not killing them, but severing the invisible strings that tied them to the source. In the center of the first arch we found them. A man and a woman, chained not by iron, but by a single thick filament of gold that had grown into their skin, fusing their wrists together. They were curled together, breathing synchronized, eyes closed, and had clearly been that way for a very long time. The system didn't offer a reward. It offered a read. Status: Prime account. Bond integrity: 100%. Current state: eternal stasis. I knelt beside them. The man's hand was locked into the woman's, and the gold thread was pulsing with a slow, rhythmic beat. It was the most stable bond I'd ever seen. It wasn't a feast for the lender, it was a battery. The lender had kept them alive for centuries, not out of mercy, but because their refusal to let go had created a perpetual energy source. I looked at the chains. I looked at the way the gold filament bled into the iridescent stone of the arch. "It's a closed loop," I muttered. "He's using them as a stabilizer for the whole system." Wanqing didn't hesitate. She didn't ask if it was a risk. She stepped forward and drove her longsword directly into the center of the gold filament. The scream wasn't audible. It was a conceptual blast that hit us both in the gut. Gold thread snapped, and the recoil sent a shockwave through the valley that leveled the remaining iridescent arches. The 2 captives gasped, their eyes snapping open for the first time in an eternity. They didn't know who we were. They didn't know where they were. But they knew the weight of the chain was gone. As they collapsed into each other's arms, the man looked up at me. His voice was a dry rasp, The sound of a throat that hadn't held water for 1,000 years. He didn't thank us. He just pointed further up the mountain toward the final peak. The instrument, he whispered, the one who holds the pen. He told us something then that changed the entire arithmetic of the war. He told us that the Hearthbond was a two-way street. Lender didn't just take, the instrument shared. Every surge of power I'd received, every single boon, had been a mirrored reflection. The lender had been feeding us just enough to make the eventual harvest worth the effort. But there was a catch, the most important one. Glenn explained that for eons, the bonded pairs had always fought the lender, always tried to protect each other, always pushed the energy away from the source. They'd used the bond only as defense. A shield does nothing on its own. It has to actually hit something to matter. None of them ever thought to point it back, the man said, his eyes glazing over as the sudden freedom began to take its toll on his ancient body. They fought the lender. They never fought the bond itself. They never turned the instrument toward the maker. I stood up, the blackened iron relic humming in my hand. The logic was simple. The lender had built a system that harvested devotion. He had created a tool that turned love into a currency he could spend. He had spent an eternity being the one who collected. If the instrument shared both ways, it meant the lender was connected to the bond just as much as we were. He wasn't just the banker, he was part of the ledger. And if we could find the source, we wouldn't just be fighting a monster. We would be filing a countersuit. We left the freed pair with the few supplies we had left and began the final ascent. The air grew thin. The sky turned a bruised, unnatural purple. The gold thread in my chest was no longer a needle, it was a vibrating wire, pulling me toward a single point of absolute gravity. We reached the summit. There were no gates, there was no fortress, there was only a single massive chamber carved into the heart of the mountain. The walls were made of that same shifting, iridescent glass, reflecting 1,000 different versions of us. In the center of the room, floating in a sea of liquid gold, was the source. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a creature. It was a slow-spinning cluster of crystalline angles, hard-edged and faceted, humming at a frequency I felt in my own bones before I heard it. And standing before it, waiting with a look of clinical boredom, was the lender. He didn't have the iridescent skin now. He was back in the black silk robes, looking like a man who'd finished a long day at the office and was waiting for one last client to stop shouting so he could close up. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. As we stepped into the chamber, the liquid gold beneath the core began to ripple, and the thread in my chest pulled taut enough to ache. Lender smiled, and for the first time I saw the real thing underneath it, not hunger. Something closer to welcome, and it was worse than hunger by a wide margin. He'd been waiting for us the whole time. The lender didn't move. He just watched us with that same professional patience, the look of a man who had already seen the end of the movie and was just waiting for the credits to roll. He didn't need to shout or threaten. The source behind him did the talking, humming a frequency that made the marrow in my bones vibrate. "You think you found a loophole," he said. His voice was a soft, dry rasp, perfectly modulated. "You think because you've read the fine print you can rewrite the law. But you're forgetting the most basic rule of the contract. The loan only works because the borrowers want it to." He stepped closer, his black robes absorbing the gold light of the chamber. He didn't look at me. He looked at the thread connecting us. He told us he'd bonded thousands over the eons. The poets called it tragedy. He called it a predictable outcome. Hearthbond never forced anyone to sacrifice themselves, he said. It simply found the people already willing to do it and waited. The loan always settled because in every pair, eventually, one of them decided the other was worth more than they were and volunteered to become the payment. I felt the logic of it click into place. It wasn't a trap based on cruelty. It was a trap based on the nobility of the heart. The lender didn't have to hunt for victims. He just waited for the moment a person's love became so absolute that they'd willingly step into the void to clear the ledger. Lesser cost wasn't a calculation of power. It was a calculation of who was more ready to die for the other. He stopped a few paces from us and offered a smile that was almost genuine. And here we were, he said, the most refined bond he'd ever cultivated. A gold-core genius and a man who'd rewritten the rules of his own existence just to stand beside her. He paused, something like clinical curiosity flickering behind his eyes, and offered us the oldest deal in the ledger, the sweetest version. No more coalitions, no more sieges. He simply erased the debt, sever the bond, let us keep the power we'd already gained, and walk away clean. Nobody had to pay, nobody had to die. We just had to let go of the thread. It was a perfect settlement. Clean. No casualties, no blood. In my old life, I would have signed that paper in 10 seconds and congratulated myself on a win. But I wasn't in a courtroom, and the woman holding my hand wasn't a client. Watching didn't even look at the lender. She looked at me. Her gray eyes were steady, the coldness long gone, replaced by something so heavy and absolute the whole room seemed to press in around it. She didn't care about the freedom. She didn't care about the sweet deal. She didn't want a world where the thread was gone. Milestone. Absolute synchronicity of will. Regard. 99% to 100%. +1 boon plus 100 devotion. The panel didn't just flare, it detonated. The old thread in my chest, which had spent the entire journey pulling me toward the source, suddenly stopped pulling. It snapped taut. For the first time since the day I woke up in this body, the meter hit the ceiling. 100%. The bond wasn't just a connection anymore. It was a closed circuit. I felt a surge of something that wasn't chi and wasn't a boon. It was a raw, unfiltered current of shared existence. I knew exactly what she was thinking, and she knew exactly what I was calculating. We weren't two people fighting a monster. We were a single unit of leverage. I told her the lender was wrong. She asked about what, and I told her the direction of the loan. I didn't let go of her hand. Instead, I gripped it tighter and did the one thing the lender's entire history had been built to prevent. I didn't push the energy away from the source to protect her. I didn't shield the connection. I reached down the thread. I treated the bond not as a lifeline, but as a straw. I didn't fight the lender's pull. I leaned into it, using the blackened iron relic as a conductor to flip the polarity of the flow. If the lender was part of the ledger, if he was integrated into the very fabric of the bond to harvest the echo, then he wasn't just the banker. He was the vault. And the vault was open. I whispered the word now, and Wanqing didn't need a second explanation. She slammed her gold core pressure into the thread, not as an attack on the lender, but as a pump. She pushed every ounce of her cultivation, every shred of her will, into the connection, and I channeled it all straight back toward the source. The inversion was instantaneous. The liquid gold beneath the crystalline core stopped rippling and began to boil. The humming frequency of the room shifted from a lullaby to a scream. The lender's expression of boredom vanished, replaced by a look of genuine, wide-eyed shock. He tried to step back, but there was nowhere to go. He was the one tied to the ledger, and we had just turned the ledger into a vacuum. We weren't paying the debt. We were withdrawing the principal. I felt the power of the hearth itself, the accumulated devotion of 1,000 broken couples, the eons of harvested grief, the raw energy of every lesser cost that had ever been paid, start to flow backward. It rushed through the thread, through my chest, and into the bond. Gold and iridescent light poured through the chamber in a single continuous surge. The lender wasn't just scared. He was watching his own accounting erase him, in real time, and there was nothing in the ledger that told him how to stop it. He reached out, his fingers clawing at the air, trying to sever the connection, but he couldn't. We had locked the circuit. We were the ones holding the pen now, and we were writing a new set of terms. The source began to convulse. The crystalline angles of the core cracked, throwing off shards of iridescent glass in every direction. The liquid gold surged upward, wrapping around us, and for a moment the world was nothing but a single roaring note of absolute power. Then the core made a sound loud enough to hurt, and the energy stopped flowing outward entirely. It started feeding us instead. The energy didn't just flow, it hammered. I felt the gold core pressure of my wife and the stolen weight of 1,000 ghosts rushing through my chest, and for a second, I wasn't sure if I was a man or a pipe. The liquid gold in the room was no longer a pool. It was a storm, swirling around us in a blinding iridescent vortex. Blender wasn't smiling anymore. He was fighting for his life. He tried to jam his hand into the flow, to pinch the thread and shut us out, but the iron relic in my grip acted like a grounding wire. Every time he pushed, I just shifted the angle, letting the current bypass his grip and slam directly into the crystalline core. Then the pressure shifted. The source didn't just crack, it detonated. A shard of iridescent glass the size of a dinner plate whipped across the chamber, slicing through the air with a high-pitched scream. It wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed at the one place I couldn't protect, the gap in Wanqing's guard where she was pouring everything into the bond. I didn't have the cultivation to block a nascent tear projectile. I didn't even have the speed. But I had the thread. I yanked. I didn't pull Wanqing away. I pulled the bond's polarity a fraction of a degree to the left. The shard missed her shoulder by an inch, carving a deep, smoking trench into the floor. The recoil sent a shockwave through my ribs that felt like a sledgehammer to the chest. I went down hard, my lungs seizing, the taste of copper filling my mouth. The flow stuttered. The lender saw the gap. He didn't go for the kill. He went for the leverage. He stepped into the vacuum I'd created, his hand snapping out to grip the gold thread between us. He didn't rip it. We just squeezed. The pain was clinical. It wasn't a burn. It was a subtraction. I felt the devotion, the boons, and the very essence of the bloom being sucked out of my frame and pulled back toward the source. My vision blurred. The sharp lines of my jaw felt like they were melting back into the soft, forgettable blur of the doormat I'd been on day one. I was losing the ground I'd fought for, and the system was screaming. Warning. Bond integrity failing. Critical drain detected. Vessel instability. 40%. The lender looked down at me, his face a mask of professional disappointment. He didn't shout. He just offered the exit. The deal still stands, he said. Let go of the thread, and he'd stop the drain and hand back both our lives and our power, so long as we stopped trying to author a story we didn't understand. It was the perfect lawyer's offer, a clean settlement. We just had to admit defeat and sever our bond. I looked up. Wanqing was shaking, her sword robes drenched in the gold spray of the chamber, her eyes locked on me. She could feel the drain. Oh, she knew the cost. Letting go stopped the pain. Holding on risked extinction. I didn't let go. I gripped her hand with everything I had left, and I smiled. Oh, it wasn't a heroic smile. It was the smile of a man who just found a contradiction in the opposing counsel's primary exhibit. Or a banker, I rasped, the words scraping my throat. He was terrified, and not of anything I could physically do to him. For the first time in an eternity, he was the one holding the debt. I didn't fight the drain. I welcomed it. I opened the valves wide, inviting the lender to take every shred of devotion he wanted, but I didn't give it to him for free. I used the iron relic to tag the energy. I turned the drain into a two-way street. If he wanted my power, he had to open his own vault to receive it, and once the door was open, I slammed it shut from the inside. I didn't try to kill him. You can't kill an appetite. You can only change what it eats. The lender recoiled, his hand snapping back as if he'd touched a hot stove. The gold thread didn't snap, but it changed. The iridescent, jagged quality of the energy smoothed out, turning into something steady, rhythmic, and terrifyingly permanent. The lender stared at the thread. He looked at the source, which had stopped screaming, and was now humming a low, contented vibration. For the first time, he looked genuinely rattled. He saw new terms, not defeat. "What have you done?" he asked. "Oh, I'm renegotiating," I said, pushing myself up from the floor, my ribs still aching but my mind clear. He liked the harvest, I told him. He loved the echo of a bond. But his whole business model was sloppy. Well, since he waited for death to harvest the grief before the account ever closed, a single big payout followed by nothing wasn't an investment. It was a scavenge. I stood beside Wanqing, our hands still locked, the bond between us no longer a wire but a living thing. I offered him a different instrument. A bond that doesn't end in a funeral, a bond that feeds on the daily life of it. Every look, every argument, every shared breath. A perpetual stream of high-grade devotion, delivered in real time forever. You don't get the feast of a single death, but you get the steady, compounding interest of a life lived together. The lender went silent. The calculation was visible on his face. He was weighing the risk of total erasure against the promise of a permanent, living battery. We'd spent eons eating the dead. I was offering him the living. The air in the chamber grew heavy. The liquid gold began to settle, forming a mirror-like surface beneath our feet. The source pulsed once, twice, as if agreeing with the math. The lender looked at me, then at Wanqing, and then back at the thread. We didn't offer a handshake. He didn't say he was satisfied. He just leaned back, the black robe settling around him, and gave a single, slow nod. The deal was struck. I felt a sudden, violent snap in my chest. It wasn't pain, but it was an adjustment. The system panel flared one last time, the text shifting from a warning to a confirmation. Contract rewritten. New terms. The living hearth. Payment. Continuous devotion stream. Status. Debt converted to equity. The pressure in the room vanished. The iridescent glass of the walls stopped shifting and became transparent, revealing the purple sky of the summit. The lender didn't disappear, but he faded, becoming a ghost in the periphery of the chamber. A silent observer to the account he'd just invested in. I let out a breath I'd been holding for 3 provinces. I leaned into Wanqing, and she didn't pull away. She rested her head against my shoulder, her breathing finally slowing. We'd won. We'd cheated the banker, rewritten the law, and walked out of the void. But as I looked down at my hand, I saw it. The gold thread was still there. It was thinner now, almost invisible, but it wasn't just connecting me to Wanqing. A second, hair-thin filament of iridescent light was stretching out from my wrist, trailing across the floor, and disappearing into the shadow where the lender stood. I looked at the filament trailing toward the lender and did the mental math. I traded a death sentence for a subscription model. We were no longer prey, but we weren't exactly free. We were a high-yield asset, a living battery that the lender would now watch with the intense, quiet interest of a man who just bought a winning lottery ticket. The lender didn't speak, but the source responded. The crystalline core, now fractured and humming, released a final, shimmering pulse. It wasn't a blast. It was a broadcast. I felt it ripple through the bond, a frequency that didn't just hit Wanqing and me, but kept going, past the summit, past the horizon, further than any signal had a physical right to travel. The living hearth wasn't just a private contract, it was a precedent. In the law, once you break a fundamental rule, the old version of that rule ceases to be absolute. Every other hearth bond in existence, every trapped couple currently shivering in some corner of Yunzhou, every pair waiting for the lesser cost to be subtracted, felt the shift. The ledger had been updated. The requirement of a death settlement had been deleted from the master file, replaced by the possibility of a living stream. Somewhere, thousands of miles away, people who had spent decades preparing to die for each other suddenly felt the weight lift. The old rights threat was just gone, mid-thought, the way a held breath goes out of you. It was the largest class action victory in history, and I'd won it without a single witness in the room. Global right update. Death settlement deprecated. New standard. The living hearth. All active bonds transitioned to equity stream. I leaned back against the iridescent glass, my ribs still throbbing, and watched the gold light fade into a soft, permanent glow. The system didn't give me a boon. It didn't give me a milestone. It did something better. It stopped charging me for the privilege of existing. "Oh, it's gone," Wanqing whispered. She wasn't talking about the lender. She was talking about the pressure. The invisible leash that had defined her life since her father's death vow, the feeling of being a prize in a game she hadn't asked to play, had vanished. The first time, the thread between us didn't feel like a wire. It felt like a choice. Then the ascension started. It didn't happen in a thunderclap. There was no sudden explosion of chi or a dramatic change in the weather. It was a gradual, synchronized rise. Because the bond was now a closed circuit, a perfect 100% loop, the power didn't just flow to one of us. It flowed through both. I felt the gold core pressure of my wife begin to leak into my own meridians, not as a borrowed surge, but as a permanent graft. At the same time, the stability I'd built through 1,000 small humiliations and calculated wins began to anchor her. We were no longer a genius and a doormat. We were a single, compounding engine of cultivation. I watched the system panels blur and merge, the numbers spinning too fast to read. Synchronized ascension initiated. Vessel refinement. Peak. Realm shift. Pillar to gold core. The change hit my bones first. The remaining dullness of the body temper years, the last lingering traces of Zhongmu's fragility, were burned away in a flash of white gold heat. My spine locked straight. My vision sharpened until I could see the individual microscopic fractures in the crystalline walls of the chamber. I didn't just feel strong. I felt calibrated. I looked at Wanqing. She was glowing, not with a mystical aura, but with a sheer physical density of power that made the air around her ripple. She had hit her own peak, her gold core refining into something harder, sharper, and more stable than any sword cultivator in the kingdom had ever achieved. We had bypassed decades of pills and meditation by simply agreeing to belong to each other. The bloom finally settled. I didn't need a mirror to know the transformation was complete. The magnetism wasn't a flicker anymore, it was a constant. I felt the weight of my own presence, a gravity that didn't demand attention but simply owned the space it occupied. I looked like the man I'd been pretending to be for months, but without the mask. I stood up, and for the first time, the movement felt effortless. No more pretending to be a piece of furniture. No more calculating the angle of a bow. I was a gold core cultivator with a legal mind and a wife who could level a city. The lender, still a ghost in the periphery, watched us with an expression of clinical satisfaction. He'd gotten his living battery. We'd secured a perpetual stream of high-grade devotion. In exchange, he'd given us the keys to the kingdom. "Let's go home," I said. The journey back was a blur of high-speed travel and silence. We didn't need to talk about the debt or the rights. The thread handled the communication. I could feel her contentment, a steady, warm hum that vibrated in time with my own heartbeat. We were the strongest pair in Yunzhou, not because of a cheat, but because we'd found the only loophole that actually mattered: the truth. As we descended from the summit and the familiar peaks of the Su clan territory came into view, the mood shifted. The high of the ascension faded, replaced by the cold, practical reality of a lawyer looking at a disaster site. Cloudfall City didn't look like a victory. From the air, the scale of the damage was clear. The outer walls were jagged teeth of broken stone. The west gate was a smoking crater. Entire districts of the lower city were blackened husks, the result of the coalition's vanguard and the lender's localized erasures. Smoke still rose in thin, gray ribbons from the residential quarters where the servants and outer clan members lived. We landed at the main entrance of the Su estate. The remaining elders were there to meet us, their faces a mix of awe and desperation. They looked at us, at our refined frames, our steady gazes, and the sheer, oppressive weight of the key radiating from us. When they didn't see the joke husband and the ice goddess, they saw the only two people capable of fixing the wreckage. I stepped forward, my boots crunching on a piece of a shattered jade pillar. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a comforting word. I just looked at the ruined courtyard, the displaced families huddling in the shadows, and the empty storehouses. Blunder had his equity. The bond was sealed. But as I surveyed the blackened ruins of the only home I'd known in this world, I realized that winning the war was the easy part. The city was a corpse, the treasury was empty, and we were the only ones left with the power to raise it from the dead. The first order of business wasn't the walls or the treasury. It was the cellar. I didn't go down there to offer a speech or a gesture of mercy. I went down there as a lawyer closing a file. Su Lan was waiting in a room that smelled of stagnant water and expired hope. The plum robes were gone, replaced by a coarse hemp shift, her ash-gray hair hanging loose and unwashed against the stone wall behind her. She didn't scream when I walked in. She didn't even beg. She just sat there, her spine curved, looking at me with a hatred so concentrated it was almost a physical weight. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a conversation. I laid the updated clan ledgers on the small wooden table between us. I didn't explain the numbers. I just pointed to the deficits. I showed her exactly how much she'd leaked to Goldfall, the precise spirit stone value of her betrayals, and the exact amount of reparations she now owed the clan. I told her the debt was absolute. She wasn't being executed. That would be too quick and too clean. She was being transitioned to a permanent labor bond instead. Every hour scrubbing the floors of the lower district, every bag of rubble hauled to clear the west gate, would count as a micro-payment against her arrears. I watched her face. The realization hit her in stages. First, the shock that she wasn't dead. Then, the slower, more agonizing burn of knowing she would spend the next 40 years as the very thing she'd spent a lifetime despising, a nameless servant with no standing. I didn't stay to see the tears. I just stepped out and locked the door. Next was the cleanup of the external debris. Yanjua tried to play the victim, claiming he'd been coerced by the coalition's higher-ups. I handled that in a single meeting with the regional magistrate. The man had been bought and paid for by Goldfall for years, a puppet in gold robes who thought he could negotiate a quiet exit for his favorite young master. I didn't use chi to intimidate him. I used a paper trail. I presented the magistrate with the original, forged annulment documents and the correspondence between Sulan and the Goldfall envoy. I bypassed the theater of a courtroom. I offered a settlement. A magistrate could either sign a decree officially stripping Yan Zhou of his sect standing and seizing his personal assets to fund Cloudfall's reconstruction, or I could send the entire cash to the Goldfall High Council. The choice took him 3 seconds. Yan Zhou didn't get a dramatic farewell. He was stripped of his gold and white robes, his top knot was shorn. When he was escorted to the city limits with nothing but the clothes on his back and a permanent ban from every Su-affiliated territory in the kingdom. He'd come to the city to claim a prize. He left as a rounding error. With the trash cleared, I spent the afternoon in the ancestral hall. I didn't pray. I just stood before the portrait of Su Wanqing's father. I placed the recovered clan seals and the restored ledgers at the base of the altar. I didn't need to say the words, but for the record, the debt was settled. The marriage wasn't a joke anymore, and the name of the man who'd orchestrated it was no longer a punchline. We'd bet on a nobody to keep his daughter safe. It had taken a few months and a different world's legal training, but the bet had paid out. The aftermath of the war settled into a new, quiet rhythm. We didn't move back into the main keep immediately. We stayed in a smaller villa on the edge of the recovering district, where the sound of hammers and shouting laborers served as a constant reminder of the work left to do. Life as the region's undisputed apex was less about fighting and more about management. I handled the logistics, the grain imports, the wall contracts, the delicate art of making the repentant elders feel useful while I actually ran the city. Wanqing handled the power. When a rival sect sent an observer to see if Cloudfall was truly stable, she didn't send a letter. She walked to the city gates, drew her sword an inch from the scabbard, and the observer decided that the city was more than stable enough. The bloom had reached its final state. I didn't look like a different person. I looked like the version of myself that had always existed beneath the noise. My presence didn't shout anymore. It just was. A ripple of space seemed to precede me in a crowded market, people parting not out of fear, but because the air around me felt certain. The ice goddess had melted, but not into something soft. She'd become something dangerous and devoted. I remember the first time she'd let me touch her hair without a hint of hesitation. The way her pale gray eyes would cut through a sea of strangers to find me, searching for my gaze just to make sure I was still there. She didn't say, "I love you," in the way the stories did. She didn't have to. She expressed it in the way she leaned her weight against me when she thought no one was looking, or the way she'd silently slide a plate of my favorite food toward me during a grueling council meeting. One evening, we sat on the porch of the villa, watching the sun dip behind the jagged peaks. Our shared silence hummed with a steady, warm pulse, a closed circuit of absolute trust. Wanqing rested her head on my shoulder. Her skin was still snow-pale, her expression still composed, but there was a softness in the line of her jaw that only I ever saw. She let the evening air settle between us. Then she shifted, her hands sliding into mine, her fingers locking tight. "I used to wonder why he chose you," she whispered. "I spent years hating the idea of it." "And now?" I asked. She didn't answer with words. She pulled me down, her lips meeting mine in a kiss that tasted of winter and something far warmer. It wasn't a desperate act or a milestone for a system. It was just a woman and her husband, finally existing in a world where they no longer had to carve a sanctuary out of the wreckage. For a few hours, the lawyer in me went quiet. I stopped calculating leverage. I stopped reading the room. I just let the silence hold us. But the silence didn't last. As I drifted towards sleep, a sudden, sharp vibration rattled the bond thread. It wasn't a surge of devotion or a shift in regard. It was a signal. I opened my eyes and looked toward the horizon. Far beyond the borders of Yunzhou, past the mountains and the clouds, a pillar of black light had just punched through the sky, boring a hole in the atmosphere that didn't close. The system panel flickered into existence, but it wasn't gold. It was a deep, bruised purple I'd never seen before. External event. The Great Seal of the Nine Heavens has fractured. New realms detected. Spirit Sovereign and Tao Ascendant active. Warning. The living hearth is now visible to the High Sovereigns. I lay there in the dark, listening to the steady, synchronized rhythm of two hearts beating as one. The villa was quiet, the smell of cedar and old ink clinging to the air. Outside, the world was still reeling from the fracture in the sky, but inside this room, the only thing that mattered was the weight of the woman beside me. I looked at the ceiling and did a final audit of the ledger. When I first woke up as Zhang Mu, I thought the cheat was the system. I thought the win was the gold core ascension or the way the bloom had rewritten my face into something the world couldn't ignore. I'd spent months treating my life like a series of depositions, calculating the exact amount of leverage needed to move a mountain. I'd played the doormat, the strategist, and the savior, all while keeping the lawyer's eye on the exit strategy. But as I felt the warmth of the bond thread pulsing between us, I realized I'd been misreading the contract. The system had been a tool. The bloom had been a byproduct. The real cheat wasn't the power to level up off another person's heart. It was the specific, absurd luck of being dropped, broke and clever, into the worst seat in the kingdom. I've been married as a punchline to the one woman in Yunzhou who was actually worth every single cost. The world saw a genius and a joke. I saw a woman who had been a blade for so long she'd forgotten how to be a person, and a man who knew exactly how to read the fine print of a broken soul. I thought about the tournament, the first time she'd looked at me like I might actually survive the week. I thought about the poison round, the near loss that taught me the difference between calculating a risk and being willing to eat one. I thought about a mountain's weight coming down on a courtyard, and the exact, specific feeling of choosing to be the anchor instead of running. Every one of those moments had looked, from the outside, like a man getting lucky. None of them had been luck. They'd been the same choice, made over and over, dressed up in a different crisis each time. The work hadn't been the cultivation. It hadn't been the battles or the political maneuvering. The real work had been choosing her, every single day, on purpose. It was the decision to stand in the line of fire not because the system promised a boon, but because she was the only thing in this world that felt real. I'd been a mediocre lawyer in a world with traffic lights and a landlord who raised the rent every March. I'd spent that whole life calculating exactly how much of myself I could afford to risk on anyone, and the answer had always come back small. Cloudfall had asked for everything, over and over, and somewhere in giving it, I'd stopped keeping a running total. That was the actual system exploit nobody had warned me about. Not the bloom. Not the regard meter. The fact that you could spend everything you had on a person and come out the other side richer than when you started, as long as you'd picked the right person to spend it on. It was the best loophole I'd ever found. I shifted slightly, feeling the permanent graft of her power humming in my veins. We were no longer two people trying to survive a rigged game. We were the house. We owned the board. And for the first time since I'd left a world of traffic lights and instant noodles, I didn't feel the need to calculate the next move. The city outside the window was rebuilding itself one cart of lumber at a time, and so was everyone in it. Mei Lin had taken over the scout network permanently, promoted out of the kill zone she'd nearly died in, and she ran it with the kind of paranoid competence that meant nobody was sneaking a second traitor through any gate on my watch. Auntie Bo still ran the kitchens, still fed twice as many mouths as the ledgers accounted for. She'll never once let me pay her back for the nephew the West Wall had cost her. Elder Fang had retired his objections along with his seat on the council, and Ren Xiao, one genius in the compound who treated me like a person before the bloom gave him a reason to, had taken his place, young, sharp, in mind to train instead of survive. None of them knew the whole story. They knew the Su clan had a monster for a daughter and a lawyer for a husband, and that between the two of us, the city was still standing. That was enough. Some contracts don't need every clause read aloud to be honored. Su Heng, for what it was worth, had started sending reports up the chain without being asked, small and precise, and never once late. The way a man behaves when he's finally decided which side of a war he wants to have been on. I let him keep doing it. Everybody deserved a clean ledger eventually, even the ones who'd been slow to pick a column. I closed my eyes, letting the silence of the room swallow the noise of the city. Beside me, Wanqing stirred. Well, she didn't wake, but her subconscious had its own priorities. Her hand, still cool as a winter morning, reached out and fisted itself tightly in the collar of my robe, pulling me closer with a possessive, instinctive grip. Even in her sleep she was holding on, making sure I hadn't vanished back into the smoke of some other life. I smiled, a real one that didn't need to be hidden behind a doormat's mask, and drifted toward the edge of consciousness. The gold panel flickered once, faint and soft the way it always had been, then settled into something that wasn't a milestone or a warning. Just a single closed line, the kind of entry a ledger gets when an account is finally, permanently settled. Status, closed, paid in full. I didn't need it to tell me that. I'd known it the moment I stopped counting. Somewhere out past the mountains, the sky still carried a scar it hadn't had a year ago, and whatever had put it there hadn't introduced itself yet. That was a problem for a version of me who still needed a system to tell him what he was worth. I wasn't that man anymore. Whatever came through that fracture would find a goldcore cultivator, a lawyer who read every line of every contract before he signed it, and a woman who'd stopped needing a sword to be the strongest thing in the room. Let it come. I read worse fine print than that and won, and I'd had a lot less on my side back then than I did now, a wife who could level a mountain range, Wayne, a city that trusted me with its treasury, and a bond that had already survived the single worst thing anyone had ever tried to do to it. I closed my eyes for real this time, Wanching's grip still fisted in my collar, and slept like a man with nothing left to prove.